Mark had promised his daughter Lily that Christmas would still feel like Christmas even if money was tight this year. He said it with a steady voice on the outside, but inside he worried because he knew promises could turn heavy when the clock ran out. The apartment was small and quiet, and the heater clicked like it was tired too. Lily had hung 2 paper stars on the wall and told him the living room looked like a real holiday movie. Mark smiled and agreed, because her hope was the warmest thing in the room. A week earlier, Lily had shown him a picture from a store flyer of a blue robot with silver arms and a bright light on its chest. She said it was called Roborex and that it could talk and spin and sing. Mark told her he would try, and he meant it, even though his wallet already felt empty before the month ended. He worked long hours, took extra shifts when he could, and still counted every coin at the end of the day. On Christmas Eve, he finally had a little cash from a last-minute job, and he decided he would spend it on that one toy because Lily did not ask for much. He put on his worn jacket, held Lily's hand, and stepped into the cold evening, telling himself that effort could still beat bad luck. They went to the first store and found shelves that looked like a storm had passed through them. They went to the second store and saw signs that said sold out on almost everything that mattered to kids. By the time they reached the third store, the sky was already dark and the streetlights made the snow look like small floating sparks. Lily stayed quiet, not because she did not care, but because she could feel her dad trying his best and she did not want to make it harder. Mark kept talking gently, saying they were on an adventure and that the best stories always had a challenge near the end. Lily nodded, squeezing his hand, and Mark wished the world was kinder to kids who tried to be brave. The third store was the biggest one, and it was packed with parents rushing and workers moving fast with tired eyes. Holiday music played softly, but the sound of carts and voices made it hard to hear the song. Mark guided Lily through the crowd, scanning shelves like a person searching for a lost key. He asked a worker about Roborex, and the worker shrugged and pointed toward the back, saying the robot aisle had been cleaned out earlier. Mark did not stop, because he could not afford to stop, not with Lily watching and Christmas morning coming like a fast train. He moved down the aisle and saw empty spaces where bright boxes used to be. He passed dolls, puzzles, and board games, but none of them were the toy Lily had dreamed about. Then he saw it, high on the top shelf, one blue box with a robot's face smiling on the front. It looked almost unreal, like it had been placed there just to test him. Mark's heart jumped, and for a second he forgot the crowd and the noise and the cold outside. He lifted Lily slightly so she could see, and her eyes widened with a quiet spark that made Mark feel like he had already won. He reached up with his free hand, fingers stretching toward the box, and he felt the cardboard under his fingertips. At the exact same moment, another hand grabbed the box from the other side. Mark turned his head and saw a man standing close, dressed in a dark coat that looked new and expensive. The man's hair was neat, his posture was straight, and his face showed the kind of calm confidence that usually comes from always being in control. His name was Richard, and he was a CEO of a large company, a man used to meetings where people agreed with him before he even finished speaking. Richard looked at Mark's hand on the box and did not pull away, as if the shelf itself belonged to him. Mark felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice polite, because Lily was right there. Richard spoke first, firm and smooth, saying he had spotted it and he needed it. Mark answered that he had reached for it first, and his voice was quiet but steady. Richard's eyes flicked down and noticed Lily, then moved back to Mark as if trying to decide how much the detail mattered. Lily stared at the robot box like it might disappear if she blinked. Mark's fingers tightened on the edge, not to start a fight, but to keep a promise alive. Around them, shoppers slowed down, sensing something tense, and a worker at the end of the aisle paused with a stack of toys in his arms. Richard exhaled like he had no patience for delays, and he said his daughter wanted this robot more than anything. Mark did not doubt that, but he also did not care, because Lily's wish was not smaller just because Mark's wallet was. Mark said his daughter wanted it too, and his tone carried a tired honesty that made it hard to ignore. Richard glanced again at Lily's coat, at the scuffed shoes, at the way she held Mark's hand with both of hers like it was the safest place on earth. For a brief moment, Richard's face softened, and it looked like he might let go. Then the moment passed, and the CEO side of him returned, the part trained to win, to close deals, to take the last seat, to be first. Richard said he could pay extra, as if money could solve any problem in any aisle. Mark's cheeks warmed, not from shame, but from the sharp feeling of being measured and priced. Mark said it was not about money, and he meant it because the promise he made was made with love, not cash. Lily tugged Mark's sleeve and whispered that it was okay, that they could get something else, and her voice was gentle like she was trying to protect him from disappointment. Mark's chest tightened, because he knew she said that for him, not for herself. Richard heard her whisper, and his eyes stayed on Lily a little longer this time. The worker started to walk toward them slowly, unsure if he should step in. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he ignored it without looking, because this small moment had become a contest he did not expect. Mark's mind raced, thinking about how he would explain an empty-handed return, how he would smile anyway in the morning, how he would pretend that not getting the robot did not break his promise. He thought about last year's Christmas when Lily was sick and they stayed inside and made paper snowflakes, and how she still said it was the best day. He thought about how she never asked for fancy things, just time, stories, and small joys. Richard shifted his grip on the box, pulling it slightly toward himself. Mark held firm, and the box bent a little under the pressure, making both men freeze for a second, because neither wanted to damage it. The air between them felt tight, like the aisle had become smaller. Richard said he had a long night ahead, and he did not want trouble, and his words sounded polite but carried a warning. Mark replied that he did not want trouble either, but he would not give up that easily. Lily looked from one man to the other, her lips pressed together, trying to understand why grown-ups were struggling over a toy. A woman nearby whispered to her partner that it was Christmas Eve and people should be kinder. Another person muttered that the store should have had more stock. The worker finally reached them and asked what was going on, and both men spoke at the same time. Richard said he had the toy, Mark said he had the toy. And the worker raised his hands, as if trying to calm a storm. Richard's voice stayed controlled, but his eyes showed irritation. Mark's voice stayed calm, but his face showed strain. The worker asked them to let go so he could check something, and for a split second, Mark and Richard both loosened their grip. The box tilted in the air, hovering between them, as if it could choose its owner. Lily's eyes stayed locked on it, and Mark felt the weight of her hope like a real thing pressing on his shoulders. Richard took a small step closer, and Mark did the same without thinking. The worker reached up to take the box, but Richard's hand slid back into a firmer hold, and Mark's hand followed, and the tug-of-war began again. The worker frowned and said there was a policy for disputes, and Richard said he did not have time for policy. Mark said he did not have time for heartbreak. Richard stared at Mark as if hearing that word bothered him, as if it cut through the clean world he lived in. Mark stared back, not angry at Richard as a person, but angry at the situation that made a father fight for a child's smile. Lily squeezed Mark's hand and whispered again that it was okay, and that whisper cracked something in Mark's heart. Richard saw it, and for the first time, he looked unsure. Then a loud voice from the front of the store called out that the registers would close soon, and the whole crowd seemed to move again like a wave. The worker said they needed to decide now, and Richard's jaw tightened, and Mark's fingers did not move. The box creaked slightly between their hands, and both men froze. Richard's gaze dropped to Lily, and Lily met his eyes with a quiet, honest look that did not ask for pity, only fairness. In that instant, Richard's phone buzzed again, and this time he pulled it out and glanced at the screen, and his expression changed in a way that Mark could not read. Richard's hand loosened just a little, and Mark felt it, and the worker reached up again, and the decision hung in the air like a final breath waiting to be taken. Richard stood frozen for a moment with the phone still in his hand and the toy box pressed between his fingers and Mark's fingers. The message on the screen was from his assistant reminding him about the charity dinner later that night where he was supposed to speak about kindness and giving. The timing felt strange and uncomfortable, and for the first time that day, Richard felt something slip inside his chest. He looked again at Lily, really looked this time, not as a detail in an argument but as a child waiting for something small that meant something big. Lily's eyes were not demanding and not angry, they were patient and hopeful, the kind of look that trusted adults to do the right thing. Mark noticed the change in Richard's posture and felt the tension shift slightly, like a rope loosening just a bit. The worker cleared his throat again and said they had to resolve the issue quickly because the store was closing and people were getting restless. Around them, Shoppers whispered and glanced, some shaking their heads, others watching closely as if the moment mattered more than they expected. Richard slowly lowered his phone and slid it back into his pocket, his grip on the box no longer as firm as before. He spoke in a quieter voice now, saying that this situation had become bigger than a toy and that he did not like being stared at. Mark answered that he did not like it either, but that he was not walking away without trying everything he could. Lily squeezed Mark's hand again, her small fingers warm against his cold skin, and she said softly that she was proud of him. That simple sentence hit Mark harder than any argument could, and he had to blink to keep his eyes clear. Richard heard it and felt a tight knot form in his throat, because no one had ever said something like that to him over a toy or a deal or a win. Richard's own childhood flickered briefly in his mind, memories of empty rooms, long hours alone, and gifts that arrived without hugs. He pushed the thought away, because he was not used to sitting with feelings that did not help him move forward. The worker finally placed his hand firmly on the box and asked both men to let go so he could check the barcode and confirm if there were any more left in the system. Mark hesitated, afraid that letting go would mean losing everything, but Richard surprised him by releasing his grip first. Mark felt the box tilt toward him, and his heart jumped, but the worker took it before either man could react. The worker scanned the box, waited a moment, then shook his head slowly and said there were no more units left in the store or nearby locations. A quiet sound moved through the aisle, part disappointment and part understanding. Richard sighed and rubbed his forehead, clearly annoyed but also tired. Mark stood still, unsure if this meant the end or a new problem. The worker said store policy suggested giving the item to the customer who reached it first, but he admitted that he had not seen clearly who that was. Richard looked at Mark, then at Lily, then back at Mark again, and he said that technically he had grabbed it at the same time. Mark did not argue, because arguing had already taken enough from him. Lily looked up at Richard and asked politely if his daughter liked robots too, and her voice was curious, not accusing. Richard nodded and said yes, his daughter loved robots and dinosaurs and loud toys that filled big rooms. Lily smiled and said she liked robots because they felt like friends that did not get tired. The simplicity of her answer made Richard swallow hard. Mark watched the exchange, surprised by Lily's calm and by Richard's silence. The worker asked them to decide quickly because he needed to close the aisle. Richard took a deep breath and said something that surprised everyone, saying that he wanted to hear Mark's story before deciding. Mark blinked, caught off guard, and asked what he meant. Richard said he wanted to know why this toy mattered so much, because he felt like it mattered for a reason beyond Christmas morning. Mark hesitated, not because he did not want to speak, but because speaking made things real. He then explained simply that he was a single dad, that money had been tight since Lily's mother passed away, and that Lily had not asked for much since then. He said that this robot was the one thing Lily talked about, and that he had promised to try, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because promises gave Lily something to hold on to. The aisle grew quiet as Mark spoke, and even the background music felt softer somehow. Lily leaned against Mark's leg, listening, and Richard felt his chest tighten again. Richard did not interrupt and did not look away, which surprised Mark almost as much as the question itself. When Mark finished, Richard nodded slowly, as if processing something heavy. Richard then spoke about his own daughter, about how she had everything she could want but still seemed distant, always busy with screens and lessons and expectations. He admitted that he bought gifts because it felt easier than time, and that tonight he was rushing because his schedule was always full. Mark listened quietly. Not judging, just hearing another father who was lost in a different way. Lily looked between the two men, sensing something important was happening even if she did not fully understand it. The worker checked his watch again and said they had to close the register in 5 minutes. Richard looked at the box in the worker's hands and then looked at Lily once more. He asked Lily what she would do if she did not get the robot. Lily thought for a moment and said she would still smile because Christmas was about being together, and then she added that she would be a little sad but that was okay too. That answer hit Richard harder than any speech he had ever given. He felt something shift inside him, something old and long ignored. Richard took a step back and said he needed a moment to think. Mark nodded, expecting the worst but hoping for something better. Richard closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and reached out to the worker, asking for the box. The worker handed it to him cautiously. Richard held it for a second, feeling its weight, not just the cardboard but the meaning that had grown around it. Mark's heart sank slightly, but he stayed still, because he had said his piece and there was nothing more to add. Lily watched Richard carefully, her face open and honest. Richard then turned toward Lily and knelt slightly so they were closer to eye level. He said softly that sometimes grown-ups forget what matters until someone reminds them. He extended the box toward Lily and said that he wanted her to have it. Mark gasped quietly, unsure if he had heard correctly. Lily's eyes widened, and she looked at her father first, seeking permission, then back at Richard. Mark nodded slowly, his throat tight. Lily reached out and took the box with both hands, holding it like something fragile and precious. She smiled in a way that made the whole aisle feel warmer. Richard stood up and stepped back, feeling both lighter and strangely emotional. The worker smiled and said that was the nicest thing he had seen all week. Shoppers nearby nodded and murmured softly. Mark thanked Richard, his voice shaking with relief and gratitude, and he said he would never forget this kindness. Richard nodded and said he hoped he would not either. As Mark and Lily turned to leave, Lily looked back and waved, and Richard raised his hand in return. The store lights dimmed slightly as closing time approached, and the moment settled into something calm and lasting. Outside, snow continued to fall gently, and Mark felt like the cold did not matter anymore, because inside his chest there was warmth that no money could buy. Mark and Lily stepped out of the store into the cold night air with the robot box held tightly in Lily's arms. The street was quiet compared to the noise inside, and snow continued to fall softly around them. Lily hugged the box to her chest like it might float away if she loosened her grip. Mark looked down at her and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes after a long and tiring day. He felt lighter than he had felt in months, not just because of the toy, but because of the reminder that kindness could still appear when least expected. Lily looked up at the sky and said it felt like the snow was celebrating with them. Mark laughed softly and agreed, telling her that maybe the world liked happy endings too. They walked toward the bus stop, their breath turning into small clouds, and Lily talked excitedly about what the robot might say when she turned it on. Mark listened closely, nodding and asking questions, enjoying every word because moments like this were rare and precious. Inside the store, Richard stood near the aisle for a moment after they left, watching the door as if something important had just walked out with them. He felt strange, not regretful, but thoughtful, like a door inside him had opened quietly. The worker wished him a good night, and Richard thanked him before walking slowly toward the exit. The holiday music followed him, but it sounded different now, softer and more real. Outside, Richard stepped into his car and sat there without starting the engine. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared ahead, thinking about Lily's smile and Mark's tired but honest eyes. He thought about his own daughter, Anna, waiting at home with decorations and lights but likely feeling alone in a big house. He realized he had spent years trying to give her everything except the one thing she needed most. He started the car and drove home with a new heaviness in his chest that also felt like hope. Back at Mark's apartment, Lily placed the robot box gently under the small tree they had decorated together. The tree leaned slightly to one side, and the lights blinked unevenly, but to Lily it looked perfect. Mark heated simple soup for dinner, and they sat at the small table talking about the day. Lily said the man in the store had kind eyes at the end, and Mark agreed, saying that sometimes people just needed a reminder. After dinner, Lily insisted on placing a thank you note beside the robot, even though she did not know where to send it. She drew a picture of a smiling robot and a snowflake and wrote thank you with careful letters. Mark watched her and felt his chest tighten again, not from worry this time, but from pride. Later that night, Lily went to bed quickly, tired from excitement, still smiling as she drifted off. Mark sat on the edge of her bed for a while, watching her sleep, listening to the quiet hum of the heater. He thought about how close he had come to disappointment and how one choice by a stranger had changed the shape of their Christmas. He promised himself that he would pay that kindness forward whenever he could, even if it was in small ways. Across the city, Richard arrived home to a house filled with lights but little sound. Decorations covered the walls, and gifts sat neatly wrapped near a tall tree. Anna sat on the couch, scrolling on a tablet, barely looking up when Richard walked in. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment, realizing how often he had done the same without really seeing her. Richard cleared his throat and asked how her day was. Anna shrugged and said it was fine, her voice distant. Richard hesitated, then sat beside her instead of heading to his office like he usually did. He asked if she wanted to help him finish decorating the tree. Anna looked surprised but nodded slowly. They stood together adjusting ornaments, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt present. He did not mention the toy store or the robot, but the feeling stayed with him, guiding his words and actions. The next morning, Christmas arrived quietly for Mark and Lily. The sun peeked through the window, lighting up the small room with a soft glow. Lily woke early and shook Mark gently, her excitement barely contained. Mark laughed and rubbed his eyes, telling her it was time. Lily ran to the tree and carefully picked up the robot box. She opened it slowly, savoring the moment, and when the robot finally came out, her face lit up like the lights on the tree. She pressed the button and laughed as the robot spoke and moved. Mark watched from the couch, his heart full, feeling like he had won something far greater than a toy. He took a photo with his phone, knowing this was a moment he would want to remember on harder days. Across town. Na opened her gifts too, smiling politely, but what stayed with her most was the memory of decorating the tree with her father the night before. Richard noticed that and felt quietly glad. Later that day, Richard thought again about Mark and Lily and wondered how they were doing. He felt a pull to do more, not to interfere, but to stay connected to the feeling he had discovered. He decided that after the holidays, he would look for ways to be more involved, not just in business or charity events, but in real moments with real people. Mark and Lily spent the rest of the day together, playing with the robot, making simple food, and watching snow fall from the window. Lily told Mark that this was the best Christmas she could remember. Mark smiled and told her that it was because they had each other. As night fell again, the city lights blinked on, and the world felt calm in a way it often did not. Somewhere between a crowded store and a quiet apartment, between a rushed CEO and a tired single dad, something gentle had taken root. It was the kind of thing that did not make headlines but changed lives all the same. And though none of them knew it yet, the story was not finished, because choices like that tended to echo far beyond a single night. The days after Christmas moved slowly but gently for Mark and Lily, like the world had decided to soften its pace for them. Mark returned to work with a lighter heart, and even the long hours felt easier because he carried Lily's joy with him. Lily talked about the robot every morning before school, explaining its sounds and movements as if it were a new friend who had joined their family. Mark listened with patience and warmth, realizing that the toy had become more than a gift, it had become a symbol of hope. Each night, Lily placed the robot beside her bed, and before sleeping, she whispered thank you to the man from the store, even though she did not know where he was. Mark noticed this and felt something deep inside settle into calm. He began to see small chances to help others, holding doors, offering smiles, sharing kind words, and each time he did, he remembered that one moment could change an entire path. Across the city, Richard found himself thinking often about the toy store and the quiet strength of the single father he had met. Meetings felt different now, and success did not feel as loud or as empty as it once had. He started leaving work earlier, choosing dinners at home instead of late events, and Anna noticed the change even if she did not say it out loud. Richard helped with homework, listened to stories about school, and learned that being present mattered more than being impressive. One evening, Anna asked why he had changed, and Richard answered honestly, saying that someone had reminded him of what truly mattered. Anna smiled and leaned against his shoulder, and in that moment, Richard knew the choice he made in that store had reached far beyond one Christmas night. Weeks passed, and winter slowly loosened its grip on the city. One afternoon, Mark received an unexpected call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, then heard a calm voice introduce itself as Richard. Mark stood still, surprised but curious. Richard explained that he had not stopped thinking about their meeting and that he wanted to help, not with money alone, but with opportunity. Mark listened carefully, unsure of what to expect. Richard offered to connect Mark with a training program at his company, one that helped people grow new skills and find better work. Mark felt his throat tighten, not from pride, but from disbelief. He asked why Richard was doing this, and Richard answered simply that kindness should not stop at one good moment. Mark thanked him sincerely, and after the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time, letting the weight of possibility sink in. When he told Lily later, she clapped her hands and said that the robot had brought them good luck. Mark laughed and said maybe it was kindness that brought it. Over the next months, Mark worked hard in the training program, balancing learning with parenting, and Lily cheered him on every step of the way. Richard checked in from time to time, not as a boss, but as someone who genuinely cared. Their lives did not suddenly become perfect, but they became steadier and filled with purpose. Lily grew more confident at school, often talking about sharing and helping others, and her teachers noticed the change. Anna, too, became more open and relaxed, enjoying time with her father without feeling rushed. One spring afternoon, Mark and Lily were invited to a small community event organized by Richard's company. When they arrived, Lily spotted Richard across the room and waved with excitement. Richard smiled warmly and walked over, kneeling slightly to greet her. Lily proudly showed him a drawing she had made of the robot and wrote "Thank you" beneath it. Richard accepted it with care, his eyes shining, and told her he would keep it forever. Mark watched the exchange and felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the help, but for the connection that had grown from a simple choice. As the event continued, Mark realized that lives could cross for a moment and still leave lasting marks. Later that evening, as the sun set and lights flickered on, Mark and Lily walked home together, talking about dreams and plans. Lily said she wanted to help people when she grew up, just like the man from the store. Mark smiled and told her that she already was helping people just by being kind. In another part of the city, Richard and Anna sat on their porch, watching the sky change colors. Richard felt peaceful, knowing that success could be measured not only in numbers, but in moments of connection and growth. He thought back to the crowded store and the robot box on the shelf, and he knew that giving it away had been the best decision he had made in a long time. The story that began with a struggle over a toy had grown into something far greater, a reminder that empathy could open doors that force never could. And as seasons changed and lives continued forward, the quiet lesson of that Christmas Eve lived on, shaping choices, guiding hearts, and proving that even the smallest act of generosity could create ripples that lasted a lifetime.